All right, today we're looking at women and early industrialization, kind of focusing on the Lowell mills and how that incorporated women into industrialization and that movement, specifically working in the mills. And then we're going to look at, that kind of labor, well, how it got to there, that kind of labor, and then ultimately the consequences of early industrialization for women with consumerism and the cult of domesticity. So the first thing that we want to look at is the development of the factory and how it gets to how the factory ends up developing. Because it was different than in England, which had factories first. And in fact, the first little mills were actually established based on like really the earliest corporate espionage. Francis Lowell, who built the Lowell mills, went to England and then basically stole blueprints for how to build the mill. But before we even get to that part, right? Okay, let's look at what was going on. So for all of the U.S. up to this point, the main type of labor was farmers. You know, obviously there were merchants and businesses and things like that. It wasn't just farmers, but most people had a family farm. And so you had individual family farms. And you also had, of course, we saw plantations and things that way. But we're looking at mostly the north here, not the south. So that is important to establish. We're going to be looking at slavery in the South and the plantation system in the next lecture. So the South was different. The South did not develop in the North. Basically, you have, as soon as the end of the Revolutionary War, North and South split in a lot of their development. And the North kind of does one thing and the South does another. So this is in the North. In the North, a lot of farmers, you had individual family farms, and it provided for people's needs. However, what happens is that you had an increase in population and technology, which left the family farms beginning to struggle to provide enough for the family. Now, with the farmers, you had artisans, and artisans were essentially, we'll say artisans and merchants, because they worked together, right? So you had artisans were the ones who created various goods, and this was a highly skilled profession. So you might have someone who, let's say, is a table maker, and they make the whole table, or usually they wouldn't just be just a table maker, but they'd be a woodworker. And so they did stuff with wood, and they built all like the chairs and tables and whatever else by hand, and did from start to finish. You usually had, so I mean, it's a craft, right? And then you would have apprentices. You'd have apprenticeships where people would work under the artisan or the master to learn the skill. And this usually was many years of learning, right? And then they sold their products to the merchants. And then the merchants sold them to the people. The merchants were the ones that had the stores, right? So the merchants, merchants bought these things, and the merchants sold it to the people. So you had the farms, and then the artisans and the merchants. One of the things that emerges with this is called the putting out system. As the farms began to struggle a little bit, and at the same time, merchants, right? Merchants had to pay for the artisan's skill. So they were looking to bypass the artisan and go straight to the people? How can they produce cheaper goods? Because of course, if you don't have to pay the higher cost, it was higher cost for the artisans because they were skilled in their labor and the apprenticeships and how long it took to do everything. So if they could find goods for cheaper, then they could sell it to the people for cheaper, but still make more money than what they were doing if they were buying from the artisans. So it was a combination of two things, right? It was the time frame, and that you had farmers and family farms that were still surviving, but not to the level that they were in the past. So there were people who were looking to find ways to make extra money to help support the family farm, and then the merchants looking for that, and new technology that was developing to make this possible. So all three of those things kind of came together. The putting out system was women and children. Women and children were participated in this putting out system to make extra money for the family, right? Because the husband and sons were still farming, so they didn't have the need or desire or time to do this. So it was targeted towards women and then their children who would help out some of it. Some of the earliest were with textiles and shoes. And so how it worked was that parts would be made. So you'd have all of the supplies, let's say, right? All the supplies would be picked up by the woman who was doing this. So she would go out to the merchant and pick up the supplies from the merchant. And this would have the cloth, the pattern. In the earliest, if you're looking at textiles, so shoes, you would have the materials and the pattern, right? And instructions on how to do it. For textiles, one of the earliest was really simple, which was just to have them use the spinning wheel for making thread, right? Or the what's the other type for it? The thread or what you would use to make cloth. So the spinning wheels were used for that. And the women, many of the women had spinning wheels or got them, and these were small ones that they could have in their house. And so then they spun the raw cotton or spun the raw wool and made it into the thread. I know there's another name for it, but they spun that, right? So then that could be used or sold in already pre-made bobbins, essentially. Some did the loom, but the loom was not around as much anymore. So they mostly is with the spinning wheel. And so they would go pick up the material. The women didn't provide the material. They went to the merchants, they picked up the material, they took it back home and made it. And it, the children would help out. So for example, with the shoes, they would start making, they would cut out the patterns, they would follow the instructions, and then sew to the leather together, and then the children would often work on the shoelaces to add to it, right? So the children would do the little small parts with it. Women were largely the ones that were doing this. And then they would return the final product to the merchant. And then, right, he would pay them per product, per piece. And so this was, this allowed the farming families to make a little bit of extra money. It could be done from home. The children could help out, and it allowed the merchants to basically undercut the artisans and make money. So that was the earliest system of it. I'll show you here. Let's look at, this is what the spinning wheel, we talked about it with the Revolutionary War too, right? So you can get an idea. This is the spinning wheel. And these, there's a variation of style of these, but this is what it kind of looked like. And this was used then to spin the thread onto the bobbin. And these were, everyone had one. Lots and lots of people had them way back at the beginning of the early colonial period. And while they were less around, they still were present and available to purchase, and they weren't super expensive there, or many people made them back in the colonial period. But by this period, if we're looking at the 1830s and stuff, people could buy them, and this could fit in the home, and so it made it accessible to be able to do from that kind of home work, if you will. So from this you have, so how does it get to the factories, right? That's the first step, is they start looking to outsource work. And women were the ones that they looked to, because textiles, that spinning wheel, all of that textiles was seen as women's labor. Women had been doing textiles and that type of labor since the beginning of time, of when this technology was around. The spinning wheel begins to change. So we'll say new technology is going to lead to a shift in the development of factories. So you have the spinning wheel is the oldest one. And that, like I said, had been around. It's why you had the spinning bees with the Revolutionary War. The next phase that happened was the cotton spinning jenny. And this cotton spinning jenny was larger and could produce more and at a faster rate. But it was more expensive. And I'll show you a picture in just a minute. And then you had a water-powered loom, and then a steam-powered one. And the looms, these often had both the spinning for the bobbins and then the actual weaving. So each of these developments, you get, let's put here, we'll just say, with the changes, all right, it allows for it to be done faster, but it's also larger and more expensive. So when that becomes the case, right, you can't have these at your house. No longer available in the home. But the merchants and other business owners began to want these larger ones because you could produce so much faster. With the cotton spinning jenny, what they started to do was they would just have a larger house where the woman could go. So the cotton spinning jenny allowed for an adaptation of the putting out system. And what it did here was someone who, usually a business owner or a wealthy merchant, would have a home or a building where they would have one cotton spinning jenny, maybe two. And then the women, instead of going to their home and working on their spinning wheel or putting together like shoes and things like that, they would go to that building and work there. But it wasn't a factory yet. There was like one or two. As you get the water-powered loom and the steam-powered loom, this is where you have these two here are going to move to factories because they're too big and too expensive to even have in a smaller building. And then they're just going to multiply and put a ton into the building itself. So let's look at the pictures here. We are the one, I didn't get all of them, but we're going to see, we'll look at the mills in a second. You'll see the rest. So this is a cotton spinning jenny. So you can see it's larger, and it has multiple bobbins here with the thread. So instead of just one with the spinning wheel, you have several going all at once. So you can produce, that's so many more as far as one person producing one hand and then spinning it and getting one done at a time versus, you know, what, 2, 4, 6, 8 done at a time. So that it definitely seems more with a merchant being like, yes, this is a better way of doing it. They can produce so much more, and I don't have to pay them necessarily a whole lot more for it. This is still small enough that it can go into a bigger home or a building that a wealthy person would own. We'll see when we look at the factories, when we talk about the Lowell mills in a second. I'll show you the pictures. Then you'll see that there's no way the water powered one and the steam one are going to be able to manage that. Okay, so you have new technology, new change. This leads to like the factories and the systems there. Now, one of the things that really creates the Lowell mills and the factory system is that because of water-powered looms, you had to have factories in certain locations, and they were good sized as well. And this leads, we'll put it with changes here too. Factories were built away from towns. And initially. And part of this was due to size and also location and needing to be near water sources and things like that. Okay, so you have the first factory, which is going to be the Lowell mills. Francis Lowell, as I mentioned, went over to England and kind of looked at the plans and took them from England. And he wanted to build a factory and it was a textile factory to begin with. And he actually did look for, when he started looking for workers, he went to the men first. He actually went to the farming men, right? This was very targeted. This was intentional because there was a realization that they needed money. And so he was hoping that, let me rewrite that as I got kind of clumped up there. He was hoping that because they needed money, that these middle-class farmers, essentially, lower middle class. There wasn't an actual middle class yet, but that was kind of where they were at. And so they knew that they were struggling, they needed some money. So he's hoping that he could get some of the younger men to come do this. But the men were not interested. And the reason they were not interested was for two reasons. One is that you still had the farmer ideal of owning land and having your own farm and working that. And that's what they had been raised with, and they were helping out their fathers. So farmer ideal and we'll say helping fathers. The second thing is that textile work was considered women's work. So they were also not interested because they're like, no, that's for women. Textile stuff, that's the looms and all of that. That's not men's work. And so they said no. And so he's started like, who am I going to get to do this? So he shifted to the young women of these farmer families because he didn't really have any other options. And of course, because of the stereotype of it being women's work. Okay, well, maybe I can get the women to do it. Now, there were some problems with this early on because the factories in England, which is where all the factories were up to this point, the English factories had a very negative reputation for women, especially. They weren't just women working in the English factories. It was children and men, and then women too and stuff. But they had especially had a negative reputation for women, well, and just it being a horrible place. So the reputation in England was that they were considered hellholes, pits of hell. Those were also for the mining stuff. There was abuse of women. Often the people above them, the managers, the ones on the floor, abused women or pressed for sexual action or what acts, essentially, that they said, like, you know, well, you want to keep your job, then you have to have sex with me and stuff. So we'll just say pressed for sex. And there was physical violence, especially towards the children. So they had young children that worked in the early factories. And worse, they actually went to orphanages and then took the children and then made them live in the factories. And until they were 18, they worked for the factories and lived there. So they took advantage of orphan children. There were, like I said, there was physical violence, pressing for sex, abuse of women. That also, as I mentioned, that they were often described as dirty, dark, and we'll say the pits of hell. They had a lot of problems. And England's going to go do their own reform with it. You're the first to create factories. You end up with kind of the most issues and things that way. But this was the imagery of the English factories. So he had a problem when he's trying to then recruit young women from these farming families into the Lowell mills, because which father and mother in their right mind are gonna be like, oh yeah, I know those factories, abuse, forced sex, to keep the job, violence, they're dirty, they're dangerous. Oh, you could have put that, we'll put that one too. Yeah, totally. Take my daughter. That sounds like a good idea for her. You know, so no one was going to, with that imagery in mind, be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead and take my daughter. The other problem with this is because of the location, right? They were far away from towns. They had to live in the factory towns. In fact, the whole creation of factory towns comes about because you had to board people at the factories because it was too far away. The women couldn't just easily go in the morning, work during the day, and go live at home. So it meant that, right, these young women would not be living at home. And there was the expectation that women still stayed at home and lived under their father's authority until they got married. There's also another issue with this that gets connected to a change in the idea of virtue and women. Remember how we talked about that women were seen as actually more sexual than men, or that's the Puritan structure and all of that? Well, after the Revolutionary War, it shifted to an emphasis on virtue and women. And then it completely transformed and shifted to this idea that women were, they were virtuous, and that women needed to have their virtue protected from the evil sexual desire of men. And this really leads to what's called paternalism, and we'll see this in the South as well. And it has that word pater again in it, which is father. And so paternalism is this idea of, having to take, it's your responsibility, it's your duty to take care of and raise and help. Maybe not raise all the time, but it's your job and duty to take care of this person because they can't themselves. Paternalism is absolutely fine when it's your children and they're young. Paternalism is super condescending and often racist or misogynistic when it's being placed on adults, and then claiming that they can't provide for themselves. And this is going to be used as an excuse in the South against slaves. as well as women in the South, even though plantation wives, it's used against women in the South. So all women in the South fell under this paternalistic view, along with slaves. And then in the North, it was targeted towards women, protecting women's virtue. Because now it had changed and transitioned to this idea that women were not necessarily asexual, but that they didn't desire sex, that they were virtuous, and the ravenous men were out to get them, and so you had to protect them against that and protect their virtue from the evils of the world. So now you have that component. You have that the factories are not close enough for them to go work during the day and come home, so they're going to have to live in the factories. And you have all these negative stereotypes and stories from the horrors of England. And so these are all his problems. How am I going to convince young women to come here and do this, because no one in their right mind would be like, yeah, take my daughter. That sounds fine. And so what he did is he created the Lowell ideal. And the Lowell ideal was really to combat all of those problems we just listed, specifically because he was going to use female labor instead of male labor, because no one wanted to work there. So the Lowell ideal was that factories could be clean and safe, right? And they would protect women's virtue. And even with it being clean and safe and protecting women's virtue, it could still make a profit. Okay, so this was the Lowell ideal. It was really structured around disproving and combating those problems. And so what he did is he set up the Lowell mills in the factory towns specifically to fit this type of situation, so that the parents would be willing to let their daughters go work in the factories, because they did need the extra money. And we'll see the early factories did provide women opportunities that they had never had before. There are positives to the early Lowell mills. It's going to go bad, because inevitably, eventually, they'll get rid of 1 and 2, clean and safe, and protect women's virtues for the sake of profit. But at the beginning of the early Lowell mills, it wasn't a horrible thing. And so we're going to look at what the structure was. But this structure and the whole setup of how they did this convinced people to let their young daughters go to the factories and work as Lowell girls, as they were said. So let's see, we're on E here. We'll look at factory structure. And then I'll show you some pictures so you can see what it kind of looks like. Now, again, we're looking at the early period here, because some of this structure does change over time. They did work around 12 to 14 hours, which is a lot. Later, when it gets worse, it could go up to 16 hours. 12 hours was more common than 14, we'll see, we'll look at the timetable. In the early structure, what this meant was different. They did work long hours. However, in a lot of the documents, the girls talk about how they were only responsible for 1 bobbin in the mills. And consequently, it would be like a half hour between needing to replace the bobbin. So the machine did a lot of the work, but it couldn't take the bobbin off when it was full and put a new one on. And so they needed women in there to replace the bobbins. And so if you were only there for 1, you would put one on and you'd have a half hour in between each time. And so early on, the girls were allowed to read a book, hang out with each other. There was another girl that wrote about how they would go outside into the grass and hang out outside as long as they paid attention to changing them. So yes, it was long hours, but it was not the constant hard labor that it becomes in later years. You did often work 6 days a week, and this is normal kind of labor for work outside of basically any of the factory stuff and business stuff that develops. They had dorms. So the women, right, they lived in at the factories, and you had 4 to 6 women per room. Now, this is one of the benefits of this, was that women, right, if you're living in these young girls in farms with their family, they still, I say small individual family farm, but they were still large, I think, in what we would consider acreage for today. And so you had neighbors, but they weren't super close. Young girls had, maybe a couple friends from school, but you weren't getting to constantly hang out with friends like kids do today. Being in these factories and then sleeping in these dorms with other women, these young girls got to make really close friendships and hang out and just talk with a lot of girls around their age. That was something and they write home about that they hadn't gotten to do before, and they really liked. That socialization with other girls outside of the family home was a big deal. So the dorms, right, it wasn't super crowded. They didn't feel like they were, shoved in there. I mean, it kind of reminds me of like more than a normal dorm, but right, you're going away and living in a dorm in college, you're getting to live with other people and experience that, and there's all these other people around in the halls as well. Here you just had more girls per room, but they got to have all of these activities that we'll talk about and friendships by living together. That was an experience that women really didn't have before. That's the whole thing is, you didn't leave your father's home before you got married. You lived with your family, and now all of a sudden they're living with other girls outside of the family home and getting to experience friendships and whole new things that in a way that didn't happen before. So that was a big thing. Meals were provided. Oh, and they did not pay. There was no cost for this. This will be important when we look at how it changes later. Meals were provided for them, and it was actually set up in a family style system. So you would go down at mealtime, and they would all sit at the table and eat together. They also required the girls had to cook and prepare the meals. They took turns, had to take turns cooking and preparing meals. Now, there was a cook, but they had to help. And that was definitely this thing of trying to prove, like, we're not, they're still going to be able to get married and be wives, right? That end goal. Why do this, right? It's for motherhood and wife. And so this was reinforcing those ideas. Yes, they're working in the factories, but we're still making sure that they're going to be prepared to do that. They also had expectations and lessons on manners. So there was, how you eat, how you set the table, all of those things. They had rules for that, okay? They were paid $1.50 to $2 a week, which, again, when you're always looking at money from the 1800s, sounds like nothing, but it actually wasn't horrible. And the important thing is that they had a Lowell's bank that they created, so the girls could put their money into savings. So while they were sending, most of the girls sent money home, but they almost always kept some for themselves. And this was off for most the first time that I'm having just trouble writing today, apparently. This was the first time that for many they had their own money, to the point that they had savings, and they save their money, and then there were weekend trips to town where they could go buy things that they wanted. So this sense of independence was massive in these early years. Yes, it was hard work. It was long hours. But the independence you got financially, and just locally from not being under your parents' house, and the relationships they got was huge. And many girls, that's what they focused on, even with saying, well, yes, it is hard work, but I get all of these things out of it. They also provided classes for the women. So if they wanted to, these were optional, but there were different classes that they could take to improve themselves. They had a library where the girls could check out books, and read and stuff, whatever. And then they also had the Lowell Offering. The Lowell Offering was a magazine that was written and published by the girls. So another activity that they could do. It also will become a propaganda tool for the Lowell Mills, but there was independence in it to a degree. They also had a hospital for those that got sick or injury. I mean, so the early, and this system I'm listing was specifically created to establish that idea of protecting women's virtue, but still make a profit. And then they had rules. So let's put that on early. That's the factory structure. Let's put this as a early factory. We'll just separate it out here. So early function, goals of factory, right? Besides, of course, making money. So the one is you had these rules in place for the girls. And this was, again, to prove, see, we're making sure we protect their virtue. They had a curfew, so they weren't free. Again, that paternalism, right? They weren't free to just run around and do whatever they wanted. There was the owner, plus they had a house mom, basically, that was there for the dorms to make sure that everything was proper. They were not allowed to court or date. Mostly it was courting back then, but that's like dating with the intent to marry. Men were not allowed in the dorms, and in fact, on the factory grounds, everyone was checked, so there was no just people freely walking around. They had a dress code for the girls, so that one of the things that the English factories talked about was that they were shabby and dressed in rags and stuff. So having the appearance of well put together, look, we're not abusing them, we're not mistreating them, and then they had behavior requirements as well. And this was all to prove that they were protecting the girls, right? It was also clean and safe initially, with lots of green plants. They actually had plants all over the place. And the reason for this was to prove it was the opposite of England, right? Pits of hell, dirt, dark, dangerous. Instead, let's make sure there's lots of sunlight, open windows, plants. And we'll show you just a second. After I finish this one thing here, we'll look at the images and stuff. The Lowell Offering looks like the secret garden. It's a woman walking out surrounded by plants. And that's it, right? Greenery and sunlight, clean, opposite of the English factories. The fact that the room and board was provided for them is important. because there weren't extra charges. We'll just say that there were not extra charges, right? The room and food provided. That's important because they weren't then, we'll see with later factory towns, everything had a price, and eventually, essentially your whole paycheck went to back to the factory. Ages for the girls were largely between 14 and 28 years, and unmarried, because again, if you got married, you couldn't work in the factories, because ultimately the end goal was that women were still going to be wives. That was their wives and mothers. That was their first thing. Then the other thing that's important to remember, especially when we look at how it shifts, they still had a family they could fall back upon. So when conditions started to go bad, many of the girls quit because it was helpful, but it wasn't necessary for survival, right? That's what made these better too. These girls were not stuck in this condition. This was something that gave them an opportunity, and in the early years, it was pretty good. And when it starts to get bad in conditions and work requirements, many of the girls stop because, well, we'll see, they try to change the system, and when that fails, they stop working because they can go back. Others stop because they got married. Well, when it shifts to immigrant labor, they don't have a choice. They need to do this job for survival, and then that allows for a system of abuse to reemerge. You have, when I mentioned, right, the slow pace of work initially was important because even though it was long hours, they could do other things in between their job. Say between jobs, right? Changing the bobbin. So that there was a lot of socialization, and then you had the independence that many cherished that they had never got to experience before, and friendships, and then a sense of community, right? So you have all that stuff that was beneficial for the early mill. So let's look at some of these pictures. Here, this one says 15 to 35. This is a little bit later. Let's see, we go here. There we go. 75 young women from 15 to 35 ages wanted to work in the cotton mills in Lowell and in one other area. And you can't read the other, but it was still, you have these advertisements for women where they're actively advertising for the women to come, especially once it was successful, right? Because those very, very early years, and again, this advertisement is for a little bit later when they're actively advertising like this. Those very early years were really the trial period to see if it would work, to see if they could prove that they could follow this Lowell ideal that would convince families to allow their daughters to do this, and that they could protect their virtue. So everything was structured around that initially. But that was a huge fundamental shift to have young women leave the home to go work. That's something that even later doesn't really happen. And the only reason it was successful, besides the Lowell ideal, was because it was in textiles, which connects back to the domestic sphere. The next one we have is looking, here is an image of some of the early Lowell mills with all of the girls working. And it's hard to see, it's a little grainy, but then you had like the foremen, the managers of the floor, but all of the women, right, were the workers. You didn't have men, no male factory workers, meaning in the bobbins and the looms, right? These were, we'll say, managers and foremen. That's a little hard to see there, but yeah. So that they were not the ones working on the looms. The women and all the rest of this are all women working on the looms. Here's the timetable of Lowell Mill. So this is in 1851. Again, a little bit later. The earliest time you're starting looking at is 1830s when this is developing. So this is still a little bit later in the time frame, but you can see, right, it has the bells. So, and it's depending on the month because it's based on light. So you start at 5 is the starting time, and you end at 7:30. And it just shifts slightly based on the daylight. 5:40 is the latest time frame. That you the latest in the morning that you start. So and then you had the different bells scheduled for lunches and things, and it talks about that, right? That after 10 minutes after the last morning bell, and at 10 minutes after the bell, which rings from meals. So when does it start? You have the dinner bell time. So everything was very much in this time sense of your life by the bell, but it was long hours and it was hard work. So here it shows the early looms. So this is what I meant about, like, right, we went from the spinning wheel to the cotton spinning jenny, to these water powered looms, and you can see they're all attached there to steam powered ones later, and you would have a whole building filled with them. These are the bobbins that I'm talking about that they changed. And there's two different types. This type, and then here are the used bobbins as well. And so then the women worked in the factories doing this. And these should be, when we'll look at a picture of a later one. They're going to pack eventually as many machines in as they can. Not surprisingly, with new technology, it creates the ability to do faster and faster work. But in those early years, each woman was responsible. She's on one, and she's doing one bobbin. That gave them the time to do other things. Here's just one more example of that other one we were seeing. And then this is later mill work. Look at all of the bobbins here, right? Tons. So they created later with the steam powered ones and the technology that it allowed for it to have rows and rows and rows and rows. And so as time shifts and the requirements change, women started being responsible for multiple bobbins at a time, which meant there was no longer breaks, there was no time in between. You were rapidly, non-stop working from one to one to one to one to one. This is when we'll see the girls start to protest, which they do. They try to change legislation on work laws, and also eventually quit. And then this is when we're going to see a shift to immigrant labor, where they can get people who are desperate enough to do this without complaining because they need it for survival. So this should be clear, just the stark contrast between this type of work and the looms to a single loom or machine that one individual was required to process. It became a lot crazier. This is the Lowell offering. Oh, but cut off the top. So it says right here above offering, it would say Lowell offering. But see what I'm talking about with the garden, the secret garden? Here's the Lowell mill in the back, and then the woman, and then she's surrounded by all of this plant life and nature. Nature and plants, because the idea was this meant clean, and the opposite of England and the characteristic of that. They did this. Was very, very intentional, but this was the magazine that the girls wrote and produced themselves, and was something that they had the opportunity. They weren't required to. This was something you could choose to do as an activity. So there really was this kind of nourishing with classes in the Lowell offering of improvement and mental stimulation. It wasn't just the drudgery of work. All of these extra things that made it more palatable for these young girls to work are going to eventually go away, right? Because they're extra fluff that doesn't help the bottom line. But in the early days, it did. And then we'll come back. I can show this picture. This is just the shift to immigrant labor began to use younger children again. So we would still consider the 14 to 28 range children in the 14 range, right? But I'm talking about younger children. They began to use younger children because they used families. When the original women of the Lowell mills started leaving as the conditions changed and they shifted to immigrant labor, then they hired whole families. And so you had not only mothers that were working now, that were married working, but also young children, including young girls, that basically when you were about 6 or 7, you started helping your family because it provided a little bit more money in the process. All right, let's look at the later mills, and then we'll look at, actually, let's look at one of the sources first, because I do want to look at Charles Dickens when you're talking about the Lowell ideal. Charles Dickens, let's see, right there, right? Charles Dickens and the general appearance of mill workers. If you want, if you need to be reminded of like what the Lowell ideal was, his writing up of the Lowell mills is a great example of what Francis Lowell was trying to achieve at the beginning. Again, some of it propaganda, some of it actually how it functioned, and certainly Charles Dickens was taken in by this. He visited, so he was invited to visit the factories. And he knew about the English factories as well. And so he was invited to come to the Lowell mills and kind of write about it. And this was intentional, to try to get it published so that it would promote it to people to have workers come. And so he says, right, let's see, where does it start? Here, right up here. There are several factories in Lowell, each of which belongs to what we should term a company of proprietors, but what they call in America a corporation. I went over several of these, blah, 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 right? With no preparation of any kind or departure from their ordinary everyday proceedings. I may add that I am well acquainted with our manufacturing towns in England and have visited many mills in Manchester and elsewhere in the same manner. So he's setting up the scene, right? I was invited to these. I came with no preparation, so they didn't change their structuring system for me. I saw what they normally do. I'm also aware of how the mills work in England. I happened to arrive at the first factory just as dinner hour was over, and the girls were returning to their work. Indeed, the stairs of the mill were thronged with them as I ascended. They were all well dressed, but not to my thinking above their condition, for I like to see the humbler classes of society careful for their dress and appearance, and even if they please, decorated with such little trinkets as come with the compass of their means. So there's a little bit of classism there of like, well, they weren't dressed like they were fancy, rich people, good job, you know, at least you're staying within your station. But this is the part, right? They were all well dressed. He's pointing that out, like they're not dirty and looking in rags and looking like they're treated horribly. These girls, as I've said, were all well dressed, and that phrase necessarily includes extreme cleanliness. They have serviceable bonnets, good warm cloaks and shawls, and were not above clogs and patterns. Moreover, there were places in the mill in which they could deposit these things without injury, and there were conveniences for washing. They were healthy in appearance, many of them remarkably so, and had the manners and deportment of young women, not of degraded brutes of burden. So again, here, this is the idea of, right, they're protected. And it's good, it's clean. The girls are clean. They're well dressed. They're taking care to make sure that they're not injured. The room in which they worked were as well ordered themselves. This is the rooms, right? In the windows of some were green plants. There's the green plants I talked about, which were trained to shade the glass. In all, there was much fresh air, cleanliness, and comfort, right? That's that Lowell ideal right there, and right here. So right there we've got, he's already set up in the first couple of paragraphs. Here's the Lowell ideal of what the clean and safe and protecting women's virtue. And then he'll get into that even a little bit more, right? So the nature of occupation would possibly, as the nature of the occupation would possibly admit of. Out of so large a number of females, many of whom were only then just verging upon womanhood, it may be reasonably supposed that some were delicate and fragile in appearance. No doubt there were. But I solemnly declare that from all the crowd I saw in the different factories that day, I cannot recall or separate one young face that gave me a painful impression. Right, so he's basically saying, like, I was looking to see if there was anyone that looked abused or unhappy, and well kept and happy and healthy. Right? That is, he's saying the women were those things. Not one young girl whom, assuming it to be a matter of necessity, that she should gain her daily bread by the labor of her hands. That's also the idea of like they're not starving children being forced to work. That definitely is a callback to the orphans that had to work in the factories in England. I would have removed those from those works if I had the power. So he's like, if I saw any girls that looked like they were being abused or were being like desperate to work to survive, or that were being abused like the orphans in England, I would have taken them away from the factory. So that's protecting the virtue and that they're healthy. They reside in various boarding houses near at hand. The owner of the mills are particularly careful to allow no persons to enter. Here is where we get our virtue, protecting the virtue, right? So there's all our little ideals completely, right? Upon the possession of these houses whose characters have not undergone the most searching and thorough inquiry. Any complaint that is made against them by the boarders or anyone else is fully investigated, and if good ground of complaint be shown to exist against them, they are removed, and their occupation is handed over to some more deserving person. There are a few children employed in these factories, but not many. The laws of the state forbid them from working for 9 months of the year. For this purpose, there are schools in Lowell, and there are churches and chapels of various persuasion, which young women may observe that form of worship to which they have been educated. At some distance from the factories and on the highest and pleasant grounds in the neighborhood stands the hospital, right? And he just talks about that it's generally taken care of. He says there is a charge for the hospital, but no girl employed by any of the corporations is ever excluded for want of means or of payment. So he's saying, right, while other people can go to this hospital too, if the girls wouldn't be excluded from treatment if they couldn't pay. And then you have the Lowell Savings Bank, and he lists how much, like, look at all the savings that they're making. I'm going to state 3 facts which will start a large class of readers from this side of the Atlantic very much. Then he says, right, there is a piano in many of the boarding houses. They also, many ladies subscribe to the circulating libraries, and they participate in the Lowell offering. Okay, so the point of this one, Charles Dickens is the best one. If you need like reference for what was the Lowell ideal, his description of all this stuff is the Lowell ideal. I mean, they couldn't have asked for better propaganda. And again, it's not that they weren't doing this stuff early on. For a period in time, this is what was happening. It's going to change, but before it's immigrant labor, before the end years as it's shifting to harsher conditions of work, this was what was around for the girls, right? When it was for white women of those lower middling farming families, this is what they did. And so he's saying, like, wow, this is really great. You know, I had this idea of what it would be within the communities based on what, you know, we've seen in England, and this is nothing like that. So again, this is a good example of that structure. I also had you look at the Harriet Robinson Lowell Mill Girls, and this one it's kind of she was part of the factory worker, and then she writes about kind of like what she saw, and was also part of it for the strikes that took place. So what she establishes is that it's like, I'm going to tell you about the description of factory life in Lowell, Massachusetts from 1832 to 1848, because that's when I was most part of it. Lowell, there was a little more than a factory village. 5 corporations were started, and the cotton mills belonged to them were in the building. Help was in great demand, and stories were told all over the country of a new factory and high wages to all classes of people, and so they're employed there, right? So they're talking about just the promotion, and that they were actively promoting and trying to get people to come. At the time the Lowell cotton mills were started, the caste of the factory girl was the lowest among the employment of women. So then this is where people get confused sometimes when they read this. She then switches to talking about
this is what it was seen. At the time the Lowell cotton mills were started, the caste of the factory girl was the lowest among the employment of women. It still technically was over teacher and midwife, but she's going to go then and comparing to what it was like in England and France, so not in the US. Particularly great injustice had been done to her real character, right? That's the abuse in England and France. She was represented as subjected to influences that must destroy her purity and self-respect. In the eyes of her overseer, she was but a brute, a slave to be beaten, pinched, and pushed about. It was to overcome this prejudice that such high wages had been offered to women that they might induce to become mill girls in spite of that opprobrium that still clung to the degrading occupation. So she's saying the imagery, so this like I said, this always confuses people because then they say, oh, the mill conditions, the Lowell mills conditions were horrible. That's not what she's saying. At the time the Lowell mills were started, the condition or caste of the factory girl was bad because of what was going on in England and France, which was that injustice had been done to them. Her purity and self-respect destroyed. She was a brute, a slave to be beaten, pinched, and pushed. She's not saying that at the Lowell mill. She's saying that was the condition of the mill girl in England and France, and so it had a negative reputation in the U.S. To overcome this prejudice, so in order to overcome those negative stereotypes, high wages were offered so that they could get mill girls to come. So that's what she's saying there. The early mill girls were of different, now it's back to the Lowell mills. The early mill girls were of different ages. Some were not over 10 years, a few were in middle life, but the majority were between the ages of 16 and 25, right? So I put 14 to 28. Again, as she mentioned, there were a few younger, but most were in that age range. The very young girls were called doffers. They doffed or took the full bobbins from the spinning frames and replaced them with empty ones. So that was what the early mill girls were doing anyway, is doing that, and then they're going to add more jobs, right? These mites worked about 15 minutes every hour, and the rest of the time was their own. So again, right, the amount of work was small, even with the long hours, right? When the overseer was kind, they were allowed to read, knit, or go outside the mill yard to play. They were paid $2 a week. The working hour of all girls extended from 5 o'clock in the morning until 7 in the evening, with 1/2 hour for each breakfast and dinner. Even the doffers were forced to be on duty nearly 14 hours a day. So she has 14 hours a day, and certainly if you're counting like the meals, then that 12 hours could easily go up to 14. And again, it did vary depending on each mill. This was the greatest hardship in the lives of these children. 7 years later, a 10-hour law was passed. And this was done because of the women, right? The women protested and pushed for new laws. So one of the areas, as much as I've been talking about the benefits of the Lowell mills, this was one area that many complained about, even when you had a lot of free time, that it was a lot of work, because especially if you're coming from the farm, you didn't have this kind of straight labor, even with the lunch breaks. And so as they kept pushing more and more work on them for those 12 to 14 hours, women pushed back and said, that's too much work. We should only have to have 10 hours. And they did get a 10-hour law passed that said that women could only work 10 hours a day. And that cut down on that insanity of most all day long. But she does say that wasn't until long after some of these little doffers were old enough to appear before the legislative committee on the subject. There again, women and being involved in the political aspect to change the law, and pled by the presidents a reduction of the hours of labor. Those of the mill girls who had homes generally worked from 8 to 10 months in the year. The rest of the time was spent with parents and friends. So there's another thing, right? They didn't work year round. They worked for a period of time and then they went home. If you had a home, right? A few taught school during the summer months. Their life in the factory was made pleasant to them. In those days, there was no need of advocating the doctrine of the proper relation between employer and employed. Help was too valuable to be ill-treated. That's another thing. That is a huge insight, right? The women were treated well because they needed them, because if they did, they wouldn't get any workers. As soon as that became not a necessity, which you'll see with the shift to immigrant labor, they said, screw that. We only care about the bottom line, and we've got workers wherever we need. So that was a huge part of it. The most prevailing incentive to labor was to secure the means of education for some male members of the family. So that's interesting too, right? That they had that one of the reasons why they allowed the girls to work is so that they could earn money for the family, so their sons, their brothers, right? The sons of the family, but the brothers of these girls could go to school. So they were working for their brother's education. Or to make a gentleman of a brother or a son, to give him a college education, was the dominant thought in the minds of mill girls. I have known more than one to give every cent of her wages month after month to her brother so that he might get the education necessary for a profession. So it is interesting, right, that even within women's labor, it's for men. But again, she's not mentioning here, but a lot of them did keep some of the money. They gave a lot away, and she's saying she knew some that gave away everything. But the amount of savings that took place in the Lowell mills, there were definitely women that were keeping some of the money each pay period, even if they were giving the majority away to their family. I have known a mother work years in this way for her boy. I have known women to educate young men by their earnings. Here, we can hardly realize what a change the cotton factory made in the status of working women. Hitherto, women had always been a money-saving rather than a money-earning member of the community. Her labor could command but small return. If she worked out as a servant or help, her wages were from 50 cents to $1 a week. If she went to house to the day to spin and weave to do tailor's work, she could get 75 cents a week and her meals. As a teacher, her services were not in demand, and the arts and the professions and even the trades and industries were nearly all closed to her. As late as 1840, there were only 7 vocations outside the home in which women of New England had entered. At this time, women had no property rights. A widow could be left without her share of her husband's or family's property. A father could make his will without reference to his daughter's share of the inheritance. He usually left her a home on the farm as long as she remained single. A woman was not supposed to be capable of spending her own or using other people's money. That's femme covert. Right? They could not do all these things. Thus, it happened that if a woman did not choose to marry, or when left a widow to remarry, she had no choice but to enter one of the few employments open to her or become a burden on the charity of some relatives. This is what she's saying is the benefit of the mills and for women, right? The economic benefit for women, because most of these women were femme sole. They did get to control the money, and the mills, to their credit, didn't immediately hand over all their money to their parents or to their fathers, even though I guess you kind of were under your father's authority with that. They allowed them to manage their money, even though they could have legally probably just straight up given it to the fathers. And just saying this was an economic benefit because there weren't a lot of options for women, and there were a lot of ways that they could end up being destitute in that process. And then she talks about the strikes, that because wages were cut down, right? That's one of the things is that wages began to be cut down, and so they began to strike. They also wrote speeches, and protested the treatment as things got worse. Okay, so those are the 2 documents that well, there was one more, but those are the 2 that we're going to look at with that. So how did it change, and how did it shift to immigrant labor? So the shift to immigration and the changes in factory. We'll put this as 3 here. We'll say shift to immigrant labor. So how it changed, okay? What happens is that cotton prices began to go down because of industrialization. And the fact that this was all new, the industrialization, the new technology, the markets, you actually had a lot of panics during this time. There's several panics. So the market went through several panics. And that's just because, things were new and it wasn't really regulated. And so it really created this sense of instability. But it would be like, it would skyrocket and then now it looks like a mountain peak. It would like go up and then it would crash. And then it would start to go up and then it would crash, and it would start to go up and then it would crash. And so in each of these, right, you had a panic. And so during this time, if you're reading about like the history, it's like the panic of 18 whatever, then the panic of 18 something else. So it was panic after panic. And that created a sense of instability. And that did cause problems when you had cotton prices go down. And so, of course, Lowell mills, they had their ideal. But at the end of the day, right, the goal was still profit. And so this ultimately led to increased hours and decreased pay. Oops, went right into panic there. Increased hours and decreased pay, which was an attempt to try to make up for the panics and the instability and the decrease in cotton prices. You also had the managers, we'll say, become less friendly or less caring. So you started to have this idea of, this is where you kind of start getting the, if you have time to lean, you have time to clean. That idea that you should always be working. And so it wasn't just that the hours went up. It was also the fact that the amount of work that they were doing increased. And so I mentioned that, right? I showed you with the bobbins, that all of a sudden the number of machines that they were responsible for was significantly higher, which that, besides just the hours going up, if you're constantly working at a rapid pace, it's exhausting. And so then this does lead to, which we looked at with the Harriet Jacobs, was a protest and a legislative action. This does lead to the 10-hour workday, and we'll say slightly better working conditions for a little bit. Now, slightly better working conditions are not better than what originally the Lowell Mills was like. Okay, so that was slightly better working conditions from the increased work hours and decreased pay. This only lasted a short while. And so, not surprisingly, what began to happen is that because of the it just became unbearable for many people, and they didn't want to work there anymore. Most of the early Lowell Mill girls left because they could. And that meant they looked for labor elsewhere, which was immigrant labor. So began to shift to immigrant labor, and in this case, right, whole families. So you now had the whole ideal of protecting women's virtue and stuff was no longer something that they worried about anymore, because it was immigrants. So it was kind of like, who cares? Once you have immigrant labor, you have a worsening of conditions because of this. So now you have, it was acceptable for married women and young children to work. Now, the children were not like orphans or anything like within England. This was the family members' kids who worked to help them because they needed to in order to survive. How this shifted and changed the whole factory system was that then they could give lower pay. They also now charged for renting homes. They converted the kind of community dorms into individual homes that families had to pay for. They now had a general store owned by the mills. And they actually, with these stores, the prices were actually higher than in town because people couldn't go always every day to the stores in town. The other reason was because what these stores would do, they were owned by the mill, right? So they would provide credit to families. So many families they didn't have any money until payday. And so what they would be able to do is go into the store and buy whatever supplies and food they needed, and they would write their name in a ledger with the amount that they owed. And then you had to pay off the credit on payday. But this forced families to end up using the Lowell Mills general store because they couldn't afford, even if they could get to the stores in town, they didn't have an extra amount of money to buy the goods outright. So they had to use the general store because they needed to use the credit, but then that forced them to not only give their money back to the Lowell Mills and other mills. Other factories began to copy the factory town structure. So it was the Lowell Mills, but then it was all these other factory towns that developed, and they all mirrored this structure now of using immigrant labor with families and owning the entire town. And so that basically everyone, all the money they gave to workers, a lot of that came back to them in rent, right? The rent was owned by the factories. So they got money for rent, they got money for the food, and this kept people in a perpetual, in a state of debt. And so it made it hard to get out of the factory town labor. Children that grew up in that often found themselves indebted to the factory town because of their parents' debt. They did end up doing more schools for children because now you had whole families. And so that it really became and shifted into kind of this community system, but mostly owned by the factory. Families often had to rent out a space. They rarely had an extra room, but they would rent out a space to single workers because single workers could not afford the rent. And so they would take on these boarders, and these houses would be very crowded. This is eventually going to lead to the tenements when we talk about the progressive era, the slums and stuff, where you had like 10 people in a single room apartment because they couldn't afford anything else. And so everything ends up starting to have a price, right? The work became more dangerous. And of course, there was no workers' comp or anything for injury. You just ended up not doing that. And how specifically this impacted women's labor is that women found themselves working far more than anyone else. And the reason for that, right, is that they were a mother and they had to take care of the kids. They did all the cooking and cleaning. So women were usually the first to rise and the last to go to bed because they had to do all the cooking and cleaning and prep work. Then they had to look out for the children, and then of course they also worked in the factory. So it created, like I said, just this insane amount of nonstop labor. You didn't ever stop. And this then also led to just general treatment declined on women as well. While it didn't ever get as bad as England, You do now have the whole expectation of looking out for the young girls and making sure they're treated right and protecting their virtue. That's no longer there. And then you do have women who start having problems with the foreman on the floor, who have to navigate sexual advances and things like that. And notwithstanding, of course, other problems at the home, there is a huge increase in alcohol consumption as the factory towns opened up bars to also take people's money, and the men would go to the bars after work and spend all their money and then come home drunk, and then you end up having abuse that way as well. So it just, and then you said you have young girls, 6 or 7, that have to start working in the factories to help support the family as well as go to school when they can. So you really have a significant deterioration of conditions. We'll pick this back up when we look at the progressive era and the cities and urbanization, because this is the beginning of that urbanization. Okay, so the next thing then is looking at for society, changes in society. Okay, so that was all the factory-based systems and stuff like that. But you have some significant changes in society that take place because of this. The first thing has to do with the economy and just general over the wealth. While for the laborers the conditions were bad and they didn't get much better, overall, if you look on average, right, there were 2 things that happened. One, people had more wealth. Again, this doesn't preclude that different specific groups, that's not necessarily the case. Also, goods were cheaper. One of the consequences of the factory systems was that they were mass producing goods, which meant that prices went down. So when you have overall on average in society that more people have wealth, and goods are cheaper, they can buy more things, right? That's what this leads to. You can buy more stuff. This, in tandem with the rise of what was the new middle class. There was not an official middle class before. There was the middling group. The industrial early market revolution and industrial period created a middle class, a very distinct middle class, which was a large group of the population. I mean, the poor were still significant, but this was a very distinct larger group than compared to the wealthy. And that these were managers, bankers, lawyers, etc., foremen of the factories. And they had enough money now to try to copy the rich, right? They wanted to be able to purchase goods for the house and copy the rich. However, they could not afford imports. Like the really wealthy, we'll say the imports or what wealthy people actually purchased. The wealthy would have dresses shipped from Paris for the latest fashion, right? They'd have very expensive grand pianos and things like that. And so this created a new type of economic consumption. And this was coupled with women in the middle class staying home, right? That was a sign of your wealth, that the wife didn't have to work. Instead, she could stay home and raise the children. And so because you now had this larger middle class with a larger economic consumption and women staying home, they became the spenders and managers of the household wealth. Right? Well, the husband, this will be also important for the cult of domesticity because the husband leaves the house, right? And so you have a whole new system of shopping that takes place, and actual stores where you have department stores for the first time, and mail books, catalogs, that you could mail order catalogs for buying stuff, and women would go and purchase stuff. And the point of the department stores and the mail order catalogs was to provide the cheaper version of what wealthy people bought. See, the thing is that in a lot of period of society, besides the ultra wealthy, people didn't buy things because they wanted them. They didn't have enough surplus money to do so. You bought the things you needed. And so this is actually going to also create an influx in, we'll put it here, new advertisements. Okay, so people in the past, they bought what they needed. They didn't buy extra stuff for the house. We have an abundance of stuff in our house these days. And in the past, people had just kind of the basic necessities. So advertisement was very straightforward. We have this table and it's this length, and then there's this and this. There was no attempt to like have the psychological component to sell you on it, because ultimately you either needed it or you didn't. But now, because women were staying home and they were the ones that had purchasing power, because they were part of that middle class that now had enough money, extra surplus money to do so, department stores were created and mail order catalogs, and there they began to shift advertisement to try to entice women to purchase things for their house, and they did. Women went and purchased additional things to add to their household because they could, and they were trying to emulate the wealthy. And so we'll look at how advertising changes. There's three kind of main stages that it does. This is the first. And instead, they did try to sometimes target a want over a need. A good example of that was Ivory soap. And they were working on a new formula, and it didn't work. But instead, what they accidentally created was soap that floated. So remember, laundry at this point is a big tub with the washboard, and it's super tedious. Everyone, I don't think there's any document that ever describes a woman liking doing the laundry, because it was a long, all-day process. It was tedious. It scalded your hands, and this normal soap sunk to the bottom. So you'd keep it in the wash tub, and then you'd pull it out and use it and scrub the clothes, and then it would drop back into the wash tub. The soap that when they were trying to change the formula, what it did is the Ivory soap floated on the water. And so they created an advertisement that says it floats, and talked about how much ease it was. And they charged more for it, even though it didn't cost them any more to make than the regular Ivory soap. So there was something. You didn't need the soap that floated. It was a convenience, and you were willing to pay more because people had money for it to do so. It was a want. It was a desire. That's that beginning shift in advertisement. Now advertising is going to get far more complex during World War I, and then in the 1920s as well. But this was that beginning, the early rumblings of that transition to that. And so you created this whole culture on purchasing power and economics, because women were expected to be the ones while their husbands were out working in the middle class to go out and buy. And they bought because they had money to do so, goods were cheaper, and they were trying to replicate in a cheaper fashion what the wealthy did. So here is a Sears and Roebuck and Co. Cover to their mail order catalog. And these books, I have a replica, like just a smaller one, they were a bigger size, like a magazine. The one I have is smaller. It's just a replica of it, but it is insane what they have in it. It has everything, anything you could possibly think of. This catalog had. So the idea that the department store is kind of like the early mall. but instead in or maybe the early Walmart, right? Instead of in all over stores, it's in one store. So the early mall, or maybe an early Walmart kind of thing, where anything you could want, and literally anything. So it had furniture, it had musical instruments, it had guns. It had tonics, as it was called, which were like, they had hair tonics for hair loss. They had these pills for women's female problems, is what they called it. It had clothes. This doesn't want to write right there. All right, well, it doesn't want to let me write right there. So let's try it over here. There we go. Apparently that was too close to the edge. It had clothes. It had anything you could think of it. I'm trying to think of like what else off the top of my head. They actually sold coffins. So it's random, like, oh, there's nice of coffins. But yeah, a whole bunch of other things too. It was this kind of all-inclusive thing. And the whole idea of a mail order catalog was pretty crazy too, right? That you could get this shipped to your house, you could read through, order something, and then they'd send it to you, let alone the department stores for women to go to. This is a little bit later, in the 1900s, but it also shows you how specifically the advertisements in magazines, or the catalogs, targeted women, because it was very clear that women were the ones that were that had the purchasing power. They may not be the ones that were going out and working and earning the money with the middle class, because women were supposed to stay home, but they had the purchasing power. So you had aids that every woman appreciates, and so it's these kind of new electronics of the 1900s that help with the home. And a lot of what was targeted towards this was home goods, because again, that was their domain. That's where they were purchasing stuff for. And so you end up actually having a whole advertising and catalog targeting towards women. Now this leads us to the cult of domesticity. Let's look at these and then I'll explain. So here's Goody's Lady Book. And I'll write some more on this, but I just want to show you these. This was a magazine, and what was crazy about this is, for the time, is that it was edited by a woman, and a lot of the articles were written by women. Now it was published by a man, because as far as owning the publishing company and stuff, but this was unique in this. And the Goody's Ladies Book definitely promoted the cult of domesticity, which we will talk about in a minute here. And so I'm going to continue to expand on this in just a minute. I want to write some of the key ideas down. But it looked at, what made a good woman, a true womanhood as a mother, and what those virtues were. And it definitely was a product of the time, reacting to the industrialized world and how that was changing for society. And then this is with the cult of domesticity. This is talking about the role of women within that, and promoting temperance, which shows the husband here at home reading with the family, versus intemperance, where you have drunken men going into the bar and leaving the wife and child behind. And that's the destruction of family, well, this is the maintenance of maintaining our proper, I'll say proper family. This was the proper role of family. And that this was women's job to maintain that. Okay, so and I'll explain in more detail when we talk about the different components of cult of domesticity, but this fit in perfectly with it. This idea of that women had the pledge a role to make this happen. And without women doing that, this is what happens instead. Okay, so let's look at the cult of domesticity, and then we'll talk about Goody's Lady Book and a couple other things in there. There we go. Let's see here. The cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity happened because as much as the middle class and the new wealth occurred, there was some fundamental changes for women because they were now at home, and it became what was called invisible labor, right? If we go back to status and value in society, okay? The previous value was production, right? That was the old value. And that was through farming and labor. And women, you know, when it was farming, their labor was visible because the husband was home on the farm and he did get to see what the wife was doing, and she often was helping out. The new value was money, right? Because now people were working outside of the home and getting paid. And so, right, this is the husband leaves the home to work outside of the home. And so the idea was that any of the work that she did, raising the kids, managing the household economy, buying things, cleaning, cooking, etc., that was happening when he wasn't around. And so even though it seems silly to suggest, it still is something that sometimes happens to this day, is that's especially for women who stay-at-home mothers, it's an invisible sense of labor because it isn't being seen done. The things just end up done. And so it's not recognized or thought about by the husband. And so you end up not having that all that work you're doing recognized as well. Then on top of that, because the new value was money, and right, women in the middle class, did not earn money. Ideally, because the whole ideal was that they stayed at home. And so if they were staying at home, they did not earn money. So therefore, their status went down. So in order to combat this was done intentionally. It was promoted through Goody's Lady Book. It was done in articles. It was a creation. We'll put it this way. Women created the cult of domesticity intentionally. And it was done in order to raise their status, right? Because they recognized the invisible labor and the declining status. This was done, and it was done through, like I said, we're still going to talk more about Goody's Lady Book in a minute, but it was done through Goody's Lady Book, other articles, and talked about in women's groups. And it was seen as an intentional way to try to elevate their status. So what the cult of domesticity, I'm going to put the title again just so it's clear. Here are the characteristics of this. Was that they called it a noble profession. And the cult of domesticity was also sometimes called true womanhood. Okay, so that will be important. Noble profession. If we just break this down for a minute. Noble, right, has its own high of it's important, right? It's valued. That word has value and importance. They picked these words carefully. Profession. Why not job, right? Job, right? That just implies that it's normal labor. a profession, right, is a calling. It's something that is usually more skilled. And usually when people say it's their profession, it's seen as more of a calling than, oh, that's just my job I go to kind of thing, okay? So the first aspects of it, that was the title. The first aspects of it, though, were motherhood, of course. Raising the children. Your job was to raise your children up, have children and raise your children. Then that's true womanhood, right? The next thing was the economic center. This was that women were responsible for maintaining the home finances. So, and this was specifically in this idea that, protect the finances even in panics. So that you were responsible for making sure that you manage the economic center of the household, which is difficult to do if there's a panic and your husband loses his job. But that was the expectation of that. The women were supposed to manage the economic center of the household. That was their responsibility. I mean, this also is why it led to, right, the purchasing agent, right? They gave all these fancy names to things because then it sounds more official. They were also the moral center. So they were supposed to protect and maintain the moral values of the family. Hence why the picture I showed of going up against alcoholism and how that was destroying the family. This goes with the last one, which was the home as a haven. They were to make the home be this protective bubble from the dangerous outside world, right? Then with the new changes in industrialization, it was seen as that now industrialization had led to individualism and competition, right? So now people were only worried about themselves. They would throw someone else, under the bus to advance. It was that the whole saying of dog eat dog world kind of thing. And so because of this, right, you were supposed to create the home as a safe spot where when the husband came home, those dangers of the outside world, the viciousness of individualism and competition was not present. And so that whole idea of women then were supposed to go against and protect from those things and also keep a moral center. Women were the biggest proponents or promoters of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a religious revival, and women would actually follow around the preachers. These were traveling preachers, and they'd go from place to place, and women would follow them around and volunteer and pass out flyers, attend the sermons. They kind of were actually like groupies. They had their favorite preachers, and they'd follow them around. But it makes sense because they were supposed to help with that moral reform. Moral reform, which is the Second Great Awakening, right? You have a religious revival, which is connected to moral reform. If you are supposed to have the home as a haven and a moral center, having moral reform would help do that. In fact, why women were the largest proponents of prohibition, ending alcohol until it actually happens later in time, was because of that picture, right? If we go back to this is that idea of the moral center and home as the haven, right? You are supposed to create this home as a haven. This is the pledge. This is your duty. And this and the outside world, specifically alcohol as the outside world, is corrupting the home. but that is your job, to keep a moral center and protect from corruption from outside forces. So you have to do this. So it makes sense that a revival, and then later pushing for prohibition, would be things that women within this middle class cult of domesticity would be interested in, because it fulfills those aspects. Now, there are other ways. This was all home focused, right? The economic center was about the home and what you were purchasing and making sure that the finances were protected in that. The moral center was part of that. The home is the haven, being a mother, right? So it really was super home centered at first. But then what they did is it began to expand out into other areas. So where we see that, sorry, there I zoomed in, was with each one of these, and I already did the second great awakening. I showed how it expanded outside of the home. With motherhood, right, one of the things that it happened with that is that, well, what if you don't have kids? This is true womanhood, is to be a mother and to be a wife. But what if you don't have kids? Like, then how do you fulfill that? That eventually branched out into social work. Women began looking at helping the poor. They would go into the poor neighborhoods and provide food. They worked with prostitutes and tried to help prostitution and ending prostitution. What's really interesting is that the women didn't blame the other women for prostitution. If you look at today, women are more likely villainized as prostitutes than men. In fact, women are arrested far more as prostitutes than the men that solicited them. And you have this kind of villainization of prostitution and prostitutes to this day. But back then, with the writings and stuff we have, and it talks about it in your book, women didn't blame, the women saw prostitution as a male problem, right? That this was happening because women were forced into it because of the male world. Because of whether that was because they had become widowed and they had to provide for their family, or that in others it was examples of how the husband had just abandoned them or was a deadbeat, and so women were forced into prostitution to survive, and also blamed it as a male problem because the men were the ones seeking it out. And of course, remember, women were now virtuous, not super interested in sex, whereas the men were. And so it reinforced that value. And so they went and they tried to help them. Now, if women actively refused help and said they were fine in that position, then they might get the blame. But the initial aspect was that this was inherently a male problem and that women should step up and help these women that needed it. But it moved into other social work of distributing food and blankets and clothes. This is eventually going to lead to the progressive era and settlement houses. So when we get to the progressive era and we talk about the settlement houses, which were ran and completely done all by women, just know that it had its background in starting because of this. For the economic center, where it expanded outside of the home, was actually with women authors, right? So this would be with books. The romance novel as a genre started during this time period, but it also was articles and like goodies, goodies. It's goodies. I always want to say goodies because of good wife, Goody, Rebecca. Goodies ladies book. I just realized I've been saying goodies the whole time. Sorry. I always do that too because I look at it and my brain just says, that says goodies, not gaudies. Okay, well, I'm going to talk again. I'm still going to talk more about them in just a minute because I want to look at what they promoted and what the emphasis. But so one of the things was that, right, you could make money as an author but still be working from home. And that was how you could reinforce protecting the economic center of your home. Because if you're bringing in money, then you have more control over being able to manage that, even if there's a panic, even if there's a significant drop in income from your husband. The moral center, the second great awakening, home as a haven, and the moral center also led to eventually looking to be involved in the public sphere of government. where we saw that, I mentioned with prohibition and other laws that they felt needed to be passed to protect the homes. This eventually expanded even to a justification for voting. So one of the things is that women had, or we'll see, were constantly denied the right to vote. And again, this doesn't come to the 1920s, but near closer to the 1920s, women found that if they connected voting to the domestic sphere, then men were more willing to accept it as a possibility. And so one of the things that women began to do is say, we need the right to vote on women's issues. Right? Look, we're not interested in the other parts of the male political realm, but they're women's issues like prohibition, like where our job is to protect keep the home in this protective sphere. And we can't do that if we can't impact certain laws. So we need to be able to vote on women's issues. And when they started connecting it to the domestic sphere this way, more people ended up supporting women's right to vote. Of course, they're going to find out that then that's not the case. Women voted all over the place. And it wasn't just women's issues, but they used it in a great way to promote that. And some did believe that because this was that role. So here you see, right, here are the components of cult of domesticity. Noble profession and true motherhood were the titles. The four main components: motherhood, economic center, moral center, and home as a haven. Initially all focused on those household responsibilities, and this was done intentionally to try to raise their status and move invisible labor to visible labor. It eventually, though, led to those ways outside of the home that I just mentioned. And it sticks around through the 1950s. It kind of goes away during the 1920s for a while with the flapper movement and challenging to gender roles. But it's still there in the 1950s. And the women in the 1950s just adapt it with the suburban housewife. So and then it goes away after that. Although you could argue that some of these things are still kind of components of mother and wife kind of thing. But it really strongly is there. You see it even in the 1950s. So this is a long-lasting thing. And we're going to come back to it. So the last thing I wanted to look at was just how this was promoted. We'll just do it as a separate thing here. We're looking at the articles and stuff, and the romance novels were one way, but you had these books and magazines that were promoted. It was a book. It was more like a magazine that was sent to the house, and the importance with this again was that it was a woman editor, and you had women writers. Right, and while it was published by a man, like you had women largely in control of this structure, and it really was an emphasis on what they argued that women were the important fabric to the household. Right, they played an important part in the domestic sphere. And it was all centered on this idea of promoting, right, that ideal domestic woman. And so it talked about the different components of the cult of domesticity and actually promoted it, right? They were to be provide an emotional and spiritual stability, and there were articles all that constantly talked about how to do that. It talked about how to be a good motherhood, and how to raise your children. Right? It looked at the domestic sphere in terms of cleaning and cooking. So giving you recipes, talking about how you can clean the home. And it preached these virtues of motherhood and domesticity. And the importance of how that created a stability within the home and made sure that it was secure. I mean, it also looked at like it promoted teaching, women in teaching as an outside job because that was connected to right, the way mothers taught and raised their children in that process as well. They had lots of pictures and images, all which promoted like basically feminism, femininity, and domestic sphere. Right, so it really did, and it's not surprising. Like this was something that was intentionally created, and so you had these books and articles and magazines that took upon this, and this ladies' books really saw themselves as empowering women to be their true selves, that true womanhood. Right, this is the best version of you, of what we can obtain, what we can do, how you can. How you're supposed to live, your behavior and structure, how to manage the household, how to raise the children, all of that to be the best possible woman. So definitely take a look in the book, right? It has at the end, it gives you a lot of images and stuff, and gives a good rundown of all four of those components of the cult of domesticity. And so even for the women who weren't aware of that this was intentionally created, it gets reinforced in society for the middle class woman as the ideal form. Okay, that's where we're ending on that. Like I said, but it had significant implications and consequences for women and changing things that we're going to see keep coming up. I mean, especially, like I said, the cult of domesticity was a huge thing that happened because of the early industrialization. The Lowell mills with early women working and those conditions was incredibly important for showing options and opportunities outside of the household and giving them a connection to friendships and some control of their own money that really wouldn't have been around for them before. And then also, like I said, the importance of when it shifts to immigrant labor, how women then are treated poorly and have to work incredibly hard, because now that they weren't part of that white middle class, and some were still white, Irish and German and other things like that, because they weren't the white American middle class, they were seen as less than, and it was no longer necessary to protect their virtue. So the whole idea of paternalism and protecting women's virtue was very narrow in its focus of who that entailed. And so, like I said, it was a huge impact on society. Not only the changes in technology, the changes in shopping and consumption and advertising, and what people could purchase, but for women's roles, it had a significant impact on these changes, which again we'll see in the progressive era, especially how that shapes that as well. All right, so next time we're going to be talking about. So that was the North. We're going to be shifting to the South in the next lecture.